Hello, good evening, and welcome back. So the 2021 census will be coming out in March, done mainly online across England and Wales, and they've decided to implement a gender question. That is to say, for everybody over 16 years of age, are you male, or are you female, or something else? And if you're something else, then you can specify that. And of course, this comes on the back of the suggestion that about 1.5% of the population are intersex, so they weren't born as either male or female, which is contested quite heavily that it's that high. But of course it gets worse when the amount that identifies transgender then creep up to about 3 or 4% of the population. But it's becoming a trendy thing amongst youngsters. But before we go into the pushback from this and why they say it's a good first step, as of course the BBC does, and their arguments for saying, why we shouldn't just base it on male and female. Well, of course, we've got to understand why it would be desired in the first place. And from a governmental control perspective, of course, that's going to be protected groups. That's going to be, how can we sway this in terms of gender pay gap, for example? Or what about when it comes to pensions? Or gender is wanted in identifications for protected groups, for job tribunals or hate crimes, that kind of thing. But more for the individual and where it could be beneficial is for diagnosing illnesses. Because, of course, bear in mind this is being used as proof of ID, so you prove who you are in order to get a GP, for example, and take it from there. And by knowing your sex as well, that would help with identifying illnesses, whether it be because you're at a higher risk group or because it's hereditary and only affects the male or female side of the family. That's fine. It's also used for sex-based discrimination, which is sexist, but not necessarily bad. So if you're talking about passports, it could be used as immigration if you're at a higher risk group, or if it's just insurance for maybe car insurance, that although it's not legal anymore, it does make sense that men, especially young men, are far more likely to be risk takers, as that's what has been needed evolutionarily speaking for us to get this far. So that's understandable, and basing it off of a group. Of course, you've got it for protecting other people as well. So if you're going for bathrooms, unless they're gender neutral, but what if it's teachers or prisons, if they're single-sexed prisons, for example, and you don't want them moving over to a female prison if they're a man, because we all know what transpires from then. And we have got actual examples of sexual assault happening to female prisoners once a male prisoner has been transferred over because he identifies as a woman, that kind of thing. But also respect to the individual to have same-sex care, whether that be if the police are stopping you in the street and need you to remove an item of clothing, whether that be like a burqa, for example, then you can request that it is a same-sex police officer that takes you away from public in order to then be able to identify you. So that kind of thing for respect of the individual. These are the core things of why we want gender or sex there in order to identify and go into the aforementioned points. With that all in mind, the main thing that they wish to point on is for their own privileges, essentially. That is it. It is saying, well, we need to know where NHS funding should be going in order to give more to the trans groups. Okay. Or we need to know more about it for the sake of tribunals and people facing unfair dismissal. Really? But this is always the common thread, that they will develop these characteristics in order to be able to claim a victimhood status, so that they don't need to work for anything, but can instead pester people in order to give it to them. And this is a sign of a well-functioning society, because you can only be in that privileged position in the first place of that claiming victimhood status will grant you boons, because there is actually enough to go around for everybody. And so you don't have to contribute at all, you can just guilt trip people into providing for you. If everybody was struggling to make ends meet for themselves, then your guilt tripping somebody else wouldn't make a jot of difference, because they're already in a difficult situation themselves, and even if they wanted to help, they're unable to. So, Owen Hercombe, 23, who is the mayor-elect of Bangor, there we are, who is non-binary. Great. It's mayor-elect. I sympathise with his constituents, but they voted him in. So Owen said more change was needed. As nice and as validating as that will feel for us to do, it really is only the tip of the iceberg for what the government can do. We need to be able to put genders other than male-female on our passports, and they need to improve the access to gender identity clinics, as well as moving towards legal gender self-ID. Australia did this in 2003, for example. But when it comes to NHS funding, it becomes a little bit more insidious. Because, as they want younger respondents than 16 to answer the question. They say, people begin to know their gender from way below the age of 16, so the fact this option won't be available and excludes trans and non-binary children is inherently discriminatory and feels a bit like Section 28. And yes, but that's okay. We do actually discriminate based on age when it comes to these things of having informed consent. This is seen most notably in psychological studies where you cannot take informed consent of an under 16-year-old because they do not have the wherewithal in order to provide that. They can't get married, for example. They can't drink alcohol. They can't vote. So what makes you think that they would actually know their gender and the ramifications when it comes to clinics like Tavistock, for example? Because they say the waiting lists for sex change clinics for under 16s is way too long. That is the main point that they're focusing on here. So, an ONX spokesman said the question was only being asked to people aged 16 and over because we anticipate gender identity data collected from persons below this age is likely to be of low quality. He said this was partly due to the likelihood of the information being supplied by a parent or guardian. He said the key data need for gender identity was for information on those aged 16 and over. Yes, it would have to be provided by the parent or guardian because the 16-year-old cannot sign off on the information they are providing for the census, in which case it does need parental consent in order for it to be signed off upon, in which case it would have to have parental influence. So yes, that is completely correct. But as I say, the main thing that they're focusing on here is having more privileges for their special group and also getting more people and younger people to transition at an earlier age, which is irreversible, leads to sterility. Most people grow out of it. It does not affect the rate of suicide before or after transitions. It is not a healthy thing to do. It really isn't. In fact, you should definitely wait until after puberty because hormone blockers mean that transitioning will not go as well as if you had waited for your body to develop naturally in the first place. Yes, just to reiterate, if you try and change your gender before puberty, the transformation procedure will not be nearly as effective as if you wait until after puberty. But, of course, that just goes against the narrative, because if you can inculcate people and get them to commit to the cult with such a permanent alteration at an early age, then they've it's kind of like a rite of passage, if you will, that they're doing something devastatingly damaging in order to prove their allegiance, and knowing that there is no going back, in which case you're trying to ostracize them from the rest of society in order to only feel welcome by your group, in which case you can then push them away from their family and friends and just be welcomed into your cult, and then you will do you will be the leader and get them to do whatever it is that you want them to do, because you're the only person showing them love and respect, because of course you've influenced them into doing something incredibly damaging in the first place and encouraged them to alienate their family from them, which is all the hallmarks of a cult. But just to prove a point, Miss Appen said the length of time trans people were kept waiting to be seen at NHS gender clinics was not humane. At the moment, non-binary people don't have legal recognition in law, which it makes difficult for them to navigate society, because when your gender identity doesn't match your ID, or when you're misgendered, it can make interactions with our mostly cis heteronormative society difficult to say the least, she said. In which case, sure, gender shouldn't be put on as nearly important, but we've been saying that to be based on an individual for quite a long time, with the exception of the aforementioned reasons, especially when it comes to medical procedures. Having an idea of how many trans people are in the UK will give an idea for people who do control funding, and hopefully they'll allocate more. Oh yes, appeal to the centralised planner. Perfect. More centralised planning. That is definitely the answer. She said she disclosed her sexuality on the previous census. One thing I would worry about is people answering the questions in a spiteful way. Transphobic tropes like, I identify like an attack helicopter, or other things like that. Or a Jedi, I think was the popular one last time, for religion. But we should all identify as proud Kekistanis, of course. When and if that does happen, are they going to filter it out? While, if they are filtering out, are they actually going to have a trans person filter out, or someone who understands? Exactly, you can't understand, because there are just too many genders. There are more genders being made every day. There are dozens, if not hundreds of genders. In which case, how do you know what is ridiculous, and how do you know what is somebody's sincerely heartfelt beliefs? Are you going to go to somebody who identifies as a wolf, for example, and say, oh no, that's ridiculous? Or what if they identify as a different ethnicity, or a different age? Is that then ridiculous? Where do you draw the line, and why are you deciding? Difficult, that, isn't it? Well, of course it isn't for them, because they don't have universalized principles. But to wrap up, an ONS spokesman said it would use an automatic system to process answers to many of the census questions where one can write in an answer, adding, these tools will then be refined once census data is received to ensure that this data is being appropriately coded. He said the ONS had undertaken extensive research to ensure only genuine identities were recorded, which they don't know, but they're just going to say, these are the most popular, and how's it going to fit into what we're looking for? Essentially, if your gender and sex don't match, or if you say non-binary or just trans, that kind of thing is what they're going to be focusing on. But the main thing with the census coming out is we're not going to know about it for a year, essentially, for it to all be compiled and come out, and who knows how much we'll actually be able to see, because it will give a far better insight into the effects of mass immigration happening over the past decade. And I think there were quite a few vital bits of information in there which would affect voting patterns, which will not want to be disclosed by the powers that be. So are they going to publish it honestly, or are they not going to publish it at all? I'm intrigued to see how this all comes out. But as always, let me know what you guys think down below. If you go, yeah, gender shouldn't be on there anyway. Yeah, I understand that it should be for some reasons, but that can just be disclosed between yourself and a medical professional, and you don't need gender for identification, in which case, just leave it out and ignore it. It doesn't matter. Or if you think, no, it should be. It should just be male and female. And the intersex people, 1.7%, that's been such a small number and hasn't really been an issue for the past hundreds of thousands of years. So let's not worry about it. Job done. Either way, let me know. Always intrigued to hear what you guys have to say. And as always, until next time, have a good one.